Hello YouTube, I'm Dakota from Bowtied Media, and today we've got a brand new review of Flux Pavilion's Fluxiverse Volume 2 EP. Flux Pavilion is here with the second installment of his Fluxiverse saga with his Fluxiverse Volume 2. The first volume came out almost a year before Volume 2 and was, in my opinion, a pretty serviceable record that predominantly felt like an old school sounding EP. But it would appear that the Fluxiverse is far from over, as we've now got Volume 2 with the potential for even more installments in the future. But just like Volume 1, Fluxiverse Volume 2 has a slew of vocal and production features on it, making for a fairly diverse sounding project that still predominantly lands within that dubstep sound. Accompanying Flux Pavilion here, and in order of the track list, is Jessica Audifred, Doctor, Cyclops, Illiman, Wooly, Cammy Robinson, and Galena. Very much a who's who collection of artists for a jam-packed EP. Starting off, the EP is Bigger Than Bad with Jessica Audifred and Doctor, and this very much feels like a modern Flux Pavilion track. A simple 1-2 snare kick dubstep sound with a big, rigid synth that is very on-brand for Flux to the point where I'd say it's potentially his signature sound at this point. But if you're looking for a classic Flux Pavilion track, this is your go-to for sure. Phantasmagoria is the second track and narratively the core of what this Fluxiverse project is. It's explicitly talked about within the track, but it's essentially the idea of bouncing back and forth between two sort of planes of existence, whereas you have your everyday life in one sphere and the partying, kind of raving, letting loose of listening to EDM on the other. On the production side of things, I really love how the track imitates that breaking down of worlds with that kind of screeching, almost alarm-like synth as that kind of other world kind of breaking in through the more standardized sounds of the rest of the sound design. It's pretty much the only narrative track on the project, and in full transparency, I'm not sure I would have really caught it if I didn't chat with Flux Pavilion in person when we did an interview. But besides that, this track is quite full in its atmospheric design and intentionality behind it, and it's a pretty neat track. Then Tock with Cyclops and Illiman is next in the track list, and this track is stylistically dominated by Cyclops, I would say. His minimalistic and heavy dubstep production is very much at the forefront of this track, with Illiman taking the verses for a very fitting rap performance. I do think that Flux Pavilion purists might struggle with this one, only because it's quite diametrically opposed to Flux's typical melody structure and mixing, but personally this is one of my favorites. And speaking of favorites, On Repeat with Wooly and Cammy Robinson is next, and it's absolutely the best track on the EP, hands down. It was the first single to be released and is without a doubt the most commercially successful track from the project so far, I should say. But yeah, it's hard not to see why. Cammy Robinson's vocals are great, and having these kind of three previous tracks of heavier, deeper vocals, it was a refreshing sound to hear in the mix as well here. And while Wooly is on this track as well, his presence isn't as obvious as some of the other features have been. Similar to Bigger Than Bad, though, this feels like the kind of more quintessential Flux Pavilion track with big heavy synth sustained and that classic sounding dubstep melody. Acid Reflux is the penultimate track and the first and only real switch up in genre here. Also the longest track of the EP, this one being a more kind of big room techno tune that very much aligns with the techno trends of 2024. It's got a big, more classic techno feel to it with less focus on that atmosphere and more on creating a dynamic mix, which is a nice switch up to the norms of today. That being said, it's a fairly underwhelming track that does its job with mixing up the formula on the EP, but not a tune I see myself really coming back to a ton. And then finishing off the EP is Point of No Return with Galena, which honestly feels a little lost in its identity. While each of the tracks up to this point have had their own style and unique production elements, this feels more or less like a direct copy of On Repeat, just 2 songs earlier. But the biggest problem for me is that On Repeat is substantially better than Point of No Return, almost to the point where I would never choose to listen to this song over On Repeat, because that one just exists and I think it's just a far superior version of this song. The structure, melody, and even vocals all feel eerily similar to each other. The main difference, though, is the mixing. And let's talk about that holistically here. Flux Pavilion tends to have a certain style of mixing to all of his tracks, and this EP is no exception, almost to the point where it kind of gets lost a little bit in it. Because Flux's music is so high-end heavy with a lot of big synth leads being predominantly within the higher register, the bass line of his tracks tend to be a little bit less focused on. And what can happen is that the final mix has a real absence of a strong supporting bass line to complement those melodies. TikTok, On Repeat, and Point of No Return tend to lean more towards that absentee bassline when it comes to mixing, with Point of No Return being the worst offender. And I don't think I would have paid too much attention to the mixing here if the other 3 tracks didn't fall into that same trap, and indeed have that commanding bassline to them. And furthermore, I was quite disappointed in how many times we ran with a copy-pasted drop. Apart from Acid Reflux, the rest of the tracks on this EP are essentially half a song. Yeah, there are some playful production elements in between drops and various song structures to get you there, but at its core, and let's be honest with ourselves, the main parts of the songs that we're listening for in EDM don't really change within each individual track. And for some people, they enjoy the stability in that, but for me, more often than not, it feels like a cop-out, especially when you're doing that 5 of the 6 times on a project. So overall, I found the tracks to be individually quite interesting and fairly solid. Flux has maintained his signature sound design while bringing on a slew of features for a pretty well-packaged EP. Holistically, I still struggle with some of the repetitive melodies and inconsistent mixing though. It's a nice collection of tracks that continues his Fluxiverse era, and just like I did with the Volume 1, I'm going to score Fluxiverse Volume 2 a Bowtied 6 out of 10. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think of this EP, in particular Fluxiverse Volume 2. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. But other than that, I'm Dakota from Bowtied Media, and I'll see you guys in another video.